Incoming transmission, operator.
Let's not beat around the bush. That video sucked. I made a bad call with the title and with the structure of my last opinion piece, which was the first opinion piece on the channel. I intentionally chose a clickbait title, and I made a clickbait comparison. If you haven't seen that video, I claimed that Apex Legends copied the idea for its ping system from Warframe, and that is quite a stretch, to put it nicely. Now, if I was going to be really generous with myself, I think it is reasonable to assume that at least a few people on the Apex Legends dev team play Warframe because it's a popular game. So by extension, it's not beyond possibility that Warframe was one of the games that triggered the idea to put a ping system in Apex Legends. And that was the conceit that I was going to go after in this video, was the idea that Warframe, among many other games, has a similar ping system to the one that Apex includes. But the problem was, I only referenced Warframe for 90% of the video, and I only casually referenced Fortnite Save the World at the very end. But that's not the only problem. The other problem was that this logic has no proof. And furthermore, Warframe wasn't the first game to use that system, so it didn't invent it. And finally, even if it was, Apex Legends system is so much better and so different that comparing them is, well, it's just dumb. I structured the video in this way with the hope that the excitement around Apex Legends would draw people into the conversation. And by extension, I hoped that conversation would lead more listeners and viewers to the show. But that's not where the idea for that video began. The conversation that I wanted to have had very little to do with the ping system at all. I intended to point out that Warframe does a lot of things that are widely praised in the industry, and it doesn't do a lot of things that are widely condemned. Warframe really fits well into the zeitgeist, and yet it doesn't get major coverage from almost any outlets for any of these things. My original goal with that video was to get people talking about a rhetorical question. Why doesn't the mainstream media cover Warframe? But wow, I missed that goal by about 30 yards. Now, I didn't remove that video despite its flaws. Here's what I did do. I changed the name and description to make them less misleading. I did add some clarifying footnotes to that video, redirecting people to this podcast and video. And I did remove the link from the Nintenno Podcast Facebook group because I didn't want to promote something that I knew was foolish and inaccurate. But the video content is still available to watch on the YouTube page, and I have made no effort to hide it. That's not my style. I own my mistakes rather than running from them, and I believe the conversation is still worth having. I believe that the root, the original idea of that video still needs to be addressed, just in a better way, in a less clickbait way, a way that is my style. So, here, in my humble opinion, are the two biggest problems with that last video. The first problem, and I'm sure I don't need to point this out, was the matter of clickbait. I made a deliberate choice to give the video a title that I knew would attract views and hopefully attract listeners to the podcast. And then I front-loaded my video with this clickbait premise, hoping people wouldn't click away. And the weakness of that premise, the full-on inaccuracy of that premise, caused my original point to get completely lost. In fact, because I structured it in this way, I doubt that most people even made it to the end of the video to hear that main point, which is on me. That's my fault. And most of the time, if a reader or a listener misses the point, it's not their fault. It's the person who's attempting to communicate that point. That's on me. People don't usually stick around when, your title and opening line is stupid and wrong. And as I said a moment ago, I wanted to talk about how Warframe does a lot of great things, but doesn't get a lot of critical praise for them. In my opinion, Warframe does a really good job of addressing a lot of the hot-button issues of gaming. If I remade that video, I could talk about how in a world full of cash-grab, free-to-play games, Warframe doesn't lock powerful gear behind paywalls, and it even allows you to trade in-game items for premium currency. That's crazy. I could talk about how Warframe offers well-developed female characters rather than one-dimensional stereotypes. I could talk about how Warframe's gear all feels unique and offers meaningful customization rather than, giving 15 reskins of a single gun and an illusion of choice. All of these are strong reasons that I could have used to defend my position that Warframe deserves more media coverage. But instead of using any of these very effective points, I chose to hang my hat on a clickbait hook, jammed into the hottest new game just to jumpstart the conversation. And that obviously was an error of judgment. So right now, let me apologize for wasting your time with inaccurate misinformation And let me apologize, not that any of them are probably listening, but let me apologize to Respawn, the developers of Apex. I didn't intend to blackball you as much as I ended up doing, especially because I actually like your game. Well, here's the second problem, though, with that last video. I don't think I was making the right video from the beginning, because I was posing a question that already has some logical answers. Now, again, I think it's a conversation worth having, but I think I needed to ask a different question. In the previous video, I said, I don't know why Warframe isn't talked about in the mainstream media, and in saying that, I implied that there was no explanation. I also heavily implied that the media was at fault for this perceived deficiency. But Reddit proved me wrong, and their feedback needs to be shared because they were right, and I was wrong. For new players like you and me, well, I don't know if you're a new player or not, but I think a lot of you guys are from the feedback you've given on this podcast. For us, it seems like a big question. Why doesn't anybody talk about a game that's great, especially one that has the following that Warframe does? Why doesn't anybody outside the Warframe community talk about it? But those of us who are new players often forget that Warframe has been around a long time. Warframe entered open beta in 2013. It was covered at the time, even if it didn't get the rollout and fanfare of other 2013 releases. And the fact is, the community of players that have been around for a long time have already come to terms with the way that Warframe was covered in 2018 and how it probably will be covered in 2019. Even though it seems like an important question to new players, it's one that has more or less already been addressed within the community. So I'm going to try this again. We're going to have the same conversation because it deserves being had, but we're going to do it like an adult, and I'm going to share my view in a way that won't make my high school debate coach send me hate mail. And for good measure, let's not put any ads in this audio podcast. After all, if I did my job the first time, this episode wouldn't even exist. So here, in my opinion, is the answer to the question, why doesn't the mainstream media talk about Warframe? Point number 1, context matters. The first and easiest answer is to simply look at the other games that came out when Warframe launched. To me, Warframe feels new, but it's not. As I said, it's been out for a long time, and 2013 saw the release of Grand Theft Auto 5, the Tomb Raider reboot, BioShock Infinite, and of course, The Last of Us. Now, there were numerous other great games, but those were all huge. These were games from either established franchises or respected developers, and they were all critically acclaimed games on release. Warframe, on the other hand, launched from the ashes of Dark Sector, a strange third-person action game that had some good ideas but received mixed reviews. And that's a long shadow for a new game to walk in. Is it surprising, then, that there wasn't enough room in the limelight? But Warframe didn't live and die in 2013. That's only the smallest part of the story. There's far more to come. Point 2, a game needs new content in order to get new coverage. Now, this sounds painfully obvious, and it is, but it's something that I didn't realize was a problem with Warframe. Our show, Nintenno Podcast, was made to appeal to players who started playing Warframe on Switch. Now, I actually started on PS4, but I barely got one piece of gear leveled into the double digits before I moved on to another game. But when it came to Switch, I decided to give it a second chance, and I was quickly hooked. Since then, my time with Warframe has been a whirlwind. First of all, Fortuna launched on PC about a month before Switch got Warframe. There wasn't a widespread marketing campaign or mass media coverage that I saw, and I'm usually pretty up on the game's industry. But I did see a few articles about Fortuna that described it as another free open-world expansion for a high-quality free-to-play game. And there were even a few of those outlets that commented that Warframe deserves attention because it does free-to-play pretty well. But it wasn't a huge amount of coverage. Nonetheless, that was new content, and I was aware of it. That's a big deal. Then the game launched on Switch the next month, so that's exciting. Those of us who began playing Warframe on Switch were instantly thrown headfirst into a massive well of content, already over 5 years deep. Before I even had time to scratch the surface of that content, I got wrapped up in the first community event that I got to be a part of, getting loot drops just from watching the game on Twitch. Then there was the Acolyte event, and not long after, Fortuna dropped. So for those of us who are noobs, those of us who started playing on Switch, Warframe has had a surge of new content. But this is far from the case for veterans. For PC players, Fortuna has been out for a few months already. If a veteran PC or console player doesn't own a Switch, then the fact that it's coming to Nintendo really didn't make any difference to them. And while the community days offer loot for everybody, they're not exactly as new and exciting for a veteran player because they've done them before. In reality, Warframe has gone through more than one content drought, and games don't get coverage when there's a content drought. Even the most popular games get left on the sidelines when there's no news to report, and that's doubly true when the game is over 5 years old. 5 may be young in MMO terms, but for the rest of the industry, 5 years is an eternity. Point number 3. A front-page game must have mass appeal. The games media industry is larger today than it's ever been. The statistics reporting site Statista.com puts the 2018 value of the global video games industry at $115.34 billion US dollars, which is up over $20 billion from 2016 and $40 billion from 2015. If trends continue, they estimate the games industry will exceed $138 billion by 2021. This market is packed to the gills with paid games, free games, AAA games, indie games, mobile games, handheld games, console games, plug-and-play consoles, and whatever it is Soulja Boy's selling. Nobody on the planet has enough time to play every game that comes out, and even large teams of people struggle to touch everything. For every game that gets featured on IGN, Polygon, GameSpot, or Game Informer, there are dozens of games that did not. How do they choose what makes the cut? Well, for the most part, the large outlets choose the games that they will cover based on broad appeal. What's going to get their website or podcast or app or magazine the most views? I think there's 2 parts to this choice. First of all, a game needs to have new and fresh and exciting ideas. But on the other hand, it also needs to have some nostalgia and some brand recognition, or some gameplay recognition in order to make it. This is why Apex Legends made such a splash. It's a new game with some exciting new mechanics that released in an exciting way, a surprise launch. But on the other side, it's also in the now established popular battle royale genre. It's from a developer that people recognize, and it draws comparisons to popular franchises like Overwatch with its class system. It's a lot of new with a lot of comfortable, and for the most part, it's all done with a high level of quality. So it's front and center on every mainstream outlet. And despite what you might think based on my last video, I actually really like Apex, and I think it deserves praise. On the exciting side, Red Dead 2 had unprecedented graphical fidelity and an attention to detail, while on the comfortable side, it came from a long-respected studio. God of War set new, exciting standards for graphics, storytelling, and world-building, showing us things that we had rarely seen before in the action genre. But it was anchored on a familiar character and had a bunch of throwbacks to the past games. Anthem is new and shiny, but it also looks like Iron Man. Cuphead mixed old and new gameplay, and it did it with art that was real old but brand new to video games. You see, the mass appeal lies in the yin and the yang. Everything that's new in these games is also so lovingly surrounded by comfortable mechanics that ease us into the newness. So let's apply those standards to Warframe. Warframe seems to have a lot of the things that we're used to as gamers. It's a looter shooter, it's got RPG progression, it's sci-fi, it's got crafting, it's got a story. At the surface, all of these things sound like comfort territory, and yet almost all of them are delivered in ways that are very different from what we're used to as gamers. No video game character moves quite like a Tenno, bullet dodging and slow-mo jumping. Very few games involve using guns and melee weapons and supernatural powers in such equal measure. The RPG progression is built on slottable mods, but the mod system isn't very dependable for new players. It leans heavily on RNG, upgrading the mods requires multiple in-game currencies, and the game doesn't explain some of the most efficient ways to get those currencies. Most of the crafting requires 2 tiers of blueprints, which is a little odd. The overall weapon blueprint plus the component blueprints. In most games with crafting, you begin collecting each resource before you actually know what to do with it. So when you finally discover its purpose, you have that aha moment, and you're only 1 or 2 resources away from being able to craft that new blueprint that you found. And you say, I'm sure glad I collected that. I didn't know what to do with it, but I'm glad I got it now. But Warframe does it the other way around. Most of the time, you get a blueprint, and you get really excited to craft something new. Then you go to the foundry and you say, okay, I need fill in the blank. I don't have any of those, and I have no idea where to find those. Now, of course, later on, you overcome this, but it's going to be dozens of hours before you reach that point. You're going to have the star chart fully unlocked before you're able to craft the things that you want to craft in a lot of cases. The story is there in Warframe, but you'd be forgiven for not realizing it. In fact, I wrapped up my first 100 hours of gameplay in Warframe without ever encountering any story other than the very basic, stereotypical monologues that only served to justify the fetch quest that I was doing. Now, that's being pretty reductive, but I think that it's fair. A lot of the story that I'm hearing is simply, here's why you need to go do this mission, or here's why you need to go do that. It didn't really have a lot of actual exposition. And those who've been playing Warframe for a while will recall that most of the beloved story quests in the game were added long after the game launched. And perhaps most importantly, Warframe inadequately explains its own core systems. In order to understand many of the most important mechanics of the game, you will probably need to consult wikis, you'll probably need to search message boards, and you'll probably need to talk to some veteran players. In fact, that's the whole reason I started Nintenno Podcast. Now, let's pause for a moment after all of that and be clear. I adore Warframe. You should know that by now. Even if you're new to the channel, it should be pretty clear that I like Warframe. But it is not a game with mass appeal. The hooks are certainly there, but they're not padded with enough familiarity to make us instantly comfortable. And the hooks are buried behind dense mechanics that are not well explained. The average gamer is just not going to bite deep enough for the hooks to sink in. This steep beginner learning curve doesn't make Warframe a strong contender for the front page of IGN or Game Informer. Now, after these points were made on Reddit, I'll be honest, I wanted to blame Digital Extremes. I knew the mass appeal couldn't really be fixed without Warframe losing its identity, but I wondered why Digital Extremes didn't simply fix the new player experience with better tutorials and better advertising. And yeah, they've made a lot of efforts on those fronts, that's clear. Even for me as a new player, going back and looking at some of the things that Warframe used to do and the way that it used to handle the opening, it's obvious that Digital Extremes has put some attention into that with their tutorial mission and the like. But why don't they do more? And that question was answered by Reddit as well. Point number 4. Maybe Digital Extremes thinks that bigger isn't always better. I posted my video on Reddit with the question, why doesn't the mainstream media talk about Warframe? And this was the very first reply. I'm pretty happy when everyone just leaves us alone, honestly. Now this floored me. I quickly responded that more players equals more money for the developer, which in turn means more content for us. This Redditor replied to me almost as quickly, but their response was much more thought out than mine. This Redditor said that as the communities become larger in gaming, they usually become more toxic. Now, this is an interesting view. When people brag about Warframe, they almost always brag first about its community. And this has been my experience as well. When I shared the video in question on Reddit, I was instantly bombed with downvotes and comments, and the thread pretty quickly disappeared to the bottom of the subreddit. But I would only categorize a single one of those comments as mean or unhelpful. Every other comment, even the ones that were the most critical, were extremely measured and accurate and informative in the way that they called me out. And that single unhelpful comment actually received less likes than most of the other helpful comments. And I don't need to tell you that that's not typical internet behavior. When my content was being torn apart, it was largely done in a respectful way. Now, let's look at the other side. It wasn't long ago when I shared my very first episode of Nintenno Podcast on Reddit. And I'll be honest, that first episode wasn't really all that great in my opinion. The first episode offered very little real content, but you know, the people were extremely kind. I got numerous messages from veterans offering their advice to the show. I got over 100 new listens to that episode before the end of the day. And players act similarly in-game. Chat is helpful, and it's fun and rewarding to be in a clan. Now, as a player, I don't necessarily agree with this way of thinking, and we're going to talk about that more in a moment, but the point stands. If DE, Digital Extremes, is not concerned about growing their community quickly, they don't have to be. There's nothing wrong with them being content with a smaller player base. Furthermore, this Redditor pointed out that even though more money is good for Digital Extremes' pockets, No one ever said that they were hurting for money to begin with. That's an assumption on my part. Maybe Digital Extremes already has all the steady income that they need. Maybe they would rather have a smaller community spending real, predictable money on their game instead of having a massive, toxic community throwing nickels and dimes at microtransactions. I realized that my assertion that Digital Extremes needs to do better was based on the assumption that DE only cares about money and player count. And it's not really fair to assume that about anybody, despite what the rest of the industry does. After all, this is the company who actually removed a microtransaction because it was being used too much. So maybe the new player experience isn't getting better because Digital Extremes cares more about its dedicated players than it does about pulling in fickle new players. Maybe the new player experience is, air quotes, bad on purpose for the benefit of the community that actually cares about Warframe. And that's kind of refreshing. But there's one final point to make, and it's a counterpoint. That's right, for a moment, I am going to take the gloves off. I'm going to stop apologizing, and I'm going to tell you one thing that a few Redditors are wrong about. I saw this in my post, and I've seen it elsewhere in the Warframe community. Keeping a community small is a lazy, ineffective way of keeping it clean. Let me say once again before I elaborate, it's refreshing that Digital Extremes cares more about keeping the hardcore gamer than they do about winning over the casual. That's something almost no other developer or publisher does, and it's great. DE does not have a responsibility to the non-player to tutorialize their game. They are not doing it wrong if they choose not to invest in the new player's experience. It's their game. It's a hardcore game, and it should remain a hardcore game. That's their niche. A bodybuilding gym should not be forced to replace their bench press with 5-pound weights to cater to soccer moms with New Year's resolutions. That's not the gym's target audience, and there are plenty of other gyms that are aimed at that demographic. But let's clear something up. If something can be done to make a community more inclusive without cheapening or harming the experience of the target audience, it should be done. It would absolutely be wrong for you to leave the lights off in the gym hoping that no one new would find it and attempt to come work out with you. That would be toxic. And saying we should stay small to avoid toxicity is a feeble excuse not to take responsibility and moderate your peers. DE probably can't develop the new user experience without further slowing their content drops for dedicated players. And that would be counterproductive. I get that. And honestly, I'm glad that they're not doing that when I think about it from this direction. But you see, we're not Digital Extremes. We're the players. There's no reason as fans that we should hope for the community to stay small. Maybe my weightlifting metaphor is silly, so let's try one that's a bit more directly connected to the topic at hand. Let's say you invite 2 friends over to play Super Smash Bros. You have fun together, just the 3 of you, but there's an extra controller just sitting there. You know you could have so much more fun if you invited one more friend. But there's also a slightly higher chance that someone could start an argument. What do you do? Do you keep playing with just the 3 of you to make sure it doesn't get toxic? No, you invite your friend. And when you find out they have extra controllers, you invite 4 more friends so that you can have an 8-way Smash battle. And then you set up a bracket. But then one of your friends goes off after he loses a 4th time. What do you do now? Well, you tell him to suck it up. You tell him to cool off or go home. You address it. Because it's worth it. Because everyone is having more fun. And because you remember that back in the day, somebody invited you too. Those of you with 500, 1,000, 1,500 hours in Warframe, that started somewhere. Someone told you to check this game out. Someone added you to a clan. Or even if you were a founder and you started your own game and nobody told you and you found it all yourself, good for you. This community you brag about so much and cling to so tightly, it wouldn't exist if new people hadn't joined you. I've known plenty of tiny, toxic communities, both in and outside of gaming. And I've known plenty of large, inviting communities. Do you know what keeps a community from going toxic? It has nothing to do with size. It has everything to do with good people treating people right and calling out the toxic people for their crap. My video was bombed with downvotes, and it should have been. Because of that response, I won't make similar mistakes again. It was stupid. It was a dumb video. That's the whole reason I'm making this rant right now. If you're part of the tiny Warframe camp, ask yourself, what's stopping you from bombing toxic people in the exact same way? If new players are toxic, it's not because you allowed them in. It's because you allowed them to be toxic by being silent. Now, I'm not claiming that you have some moral or ethical responsibility to tell people about Warframe. It's a freaking game. That would be stupid. You don't owe DE anything, and you don't owe the world anything, and vice versa. And as Reddit pointed out to me, journalists are not at fault either. They're paid to go where the readers go. It's their job. But it is not wrong of us to let them know what we want them to talk about. It's not wrong of me to say Warframe does that well too, as long as it's accurate and not a bait and switch. Again, like the past video. That's not a good example. If you like Warframe, and I have to assume you do if you're watching or listening to this, then you should be spreading the word. You should be trying to grow the community so that more of us can have fun together. And you should be brave enough to keep out toxic behavior when it comes up. It is wrong to say, let's only talk about Warframe within our circle so that no one new comes and spoils our fun. And furthermore, the fact that DE doesn't focus on the new player experience actually helps you with this moderation. Odds are pretty good that these toxic players aren't going to make it more than a couple hours into the game anyway. They will leave as soon as they feel the impenetrability of Warframe's systems to those who are not willing to invest and ask for help. And most likely, those people are going to step away. They're going to stay far away from our sacred community. The whole point of this community is asking for help, and the whole thing that people who are toxic hate is decent human interaction. So they're not going to be around. So if you're scared of Warframe becoming toxic, don't hide. Grow up and address it. Or don't. It's up to you. But remember, at the end of the day, as Smokey Bear always says, only you can prevent toxicity. So where does all this leave us? Well, first of all, it still leaves some of us a bit frustrated, but not without explanation. It leaves us all hopelessly addicted to a game that will only be in the spotlight for a few hours when a major expansion drops. But it also leaves us with a strong community, full of passionate people who want other people to have fun in a weird, exciting world like Warframe. And that honestly sounds better to me than a headline anyway. It also leaves me with another reminder that I'm still a noob in this community, even as I leave the 100-hour mark in the dust behind me. Maybe in the future, I won't jump so quickly to defend something that doesn't even need defending. Or at least if I do, I'll pick a better title. It leaves the task of promoting and growing the game to us, the players, through our passion, rather than through headlines and clickbait. It leaves us all with the responsibility of keeping our community non-toxic, by filling the message boards with positive messages and suffocating the commenters who don't. And finally, it leaves me eating crow. This is my first YouTube channel and my first podcast, and I had some preconceived ideas about what it should look like. When I began, I decided in my brain that I wasn't going to be a clickbait content creator. But then Apex Legends became a huge deal overnight, and I saw a shortcut to grow my listener base. In my mind, more people meant more ad revenue, which would lead to a better podcast. In my mind. Now, that video did get me more views, and I even got a single new YouTube subscriber. Whoever you are, I hope you're an awesome person and that you enjoy my future content, but that's not the type of podcast or video that I intend to make going forward, and that's not the way that I want to grow our channel. Yes, I do still think it's unfair that Warframe doesn't get the credit I feel it deserves. And yeah, I am still baffled that when games come up in conversations and when there's easy connection points to Warframe, nobody seems to think of it. I am amazed that it seems like not a lot of people in the mainstream media play or are aware of Warframe, and that surprises me. However, taking a cheap shot at another game isn't how I should promote my love of Warframe, especially when it's a really good game from a developer that I like. That just doesn't make sense. Maybe, like Digital Extremes, I need to focus on the core people who actually care about what I'm doing. Perhaps pulling in that clickbait viewership would have toxified the small, helpful community that I've worked hard to build over the past few months. Of course, I would love more viewers and listeners. But my hope is that new community members come seeking just that, community, rather than something to argue about. Our channel is relatively small. Okay, our channel's tiny, and our podcast is small. But I'm happy with that. And I'm also happy to welcome anyone who wants to be part of the positivity. And I'm excited to spread the word to my small circle about a game I enjoy and a community that's worth being part of. So, going forward, I'm going to be looking to Digital Extreme's example. If you have a friend that would enjoy this show, by all means share it with them, but I don't want to grow this community through some self-righteous campaign against other games or developers. Now, if developers pull crap, I'll call them on it, but I'm going to do it in a right way without misinformation. And when developers do a good job, I'm not going to make it seem as though they did something wrong. So once again, not that any of you are listening, but I apologize, Respawn Entertainment. I hope that you like what I make, and I hope that you give me a like, a comment, or a subscription, blah, 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 all that crap people say, if that's what you want to do. But I don't want you to share this with your obnoxious roommate Ted just because my clickbait title will tick him off. That's not the type of community that I want to build. In the meantime, thanks for watching this video or listening to this podcast, Nintenno. I hope to see you in space.